Okay, I want to respect everyone's time who did join. Let me go over the administrative talk that I have to do at the beginning of each one of these, and then we'll start some conversation, including how we want to proceed given our attendance today. This is Barrick Abramson. I'm with Confluence PSG, facilitating the outdoor subcommittee of the 1296 Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities for our October 29th meeting, where we'll be discussing some of the stakeholder feedback. And in theory, the plan today is to have some discussions followed by some votes on what we want to transition from ideas to recommendations. To give a sense of how we're going to approach today's conversation, uh, we're going to talk kind of big picture. I'll share some of the big themes that we saw in the feedback, both from the surveys that went out as well as some letters that were received. We received letters from some professional associations like chambers. We also received some from some different government agencies, including CPW and DNR, relating to this subcommittee's work. So we'll talk big picture themes. I'm going to want to hear from everybody else what your big takeaways were. And then we'll go through each idea one by one and talk about what the key feedback was. And really what we want to decide is one of three action steps on each idea that this group has assembled. Idea number one, or action step number one, will be to vote to advance the idea substantially as is or with minor revisions. Second action option will be to advance the idea as a recommendation, but with substantial revisions based on the input or feedback we received. Action option number three is to include discussion of the idea, but not include it as a recommendation of the subcommittee. Now, we're in a bit of an interesting situation, so I'll have to talk about our attendance right now and get your input on how we want to proceed. To go over some final administrative items, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate seeing you all on camera. If you continue to be in a place where it's safe and comfortable to do so, we'd love for you to stay on camera. It looks like we do have some members of the public. Members of the public, we're glad that you joined us. We will welcome your input at the end if you'd like to offer some. Just drop myself or Carrie Steele a message in the chat if you'd like to offer public comment. On that note of the chat, that's the only time I will ask folks to use the chat. In fact, I will specifically ask folks to refrain from using the chat during our conversations today. The chat can be distracting for folks using screen reader technologies. It can also, frankly, just distract from the conversation among the members for everyone. So we ask everybody to hold back from that. Other than that, members, we ask, as you know, for you to introduce yourself by full name the first time you speak, and anytime after that, just introduce yourself by first name so people know who is speaking. On to the business of making some votes today. It looks like right now we have 4 members. There is nothing in the formation of the subcommittee or task force that established a requirement of the members present, other than a majority of the members present, to advance one of the ideas to a recommendation. So I'm going to open it up to all of you. As I think you know, we technically have 8 members. We've got half of the members present today. We'll see if, I know Carrie has seen if she can get hold of Connor, but John and Christina are unable to join today. Members, are you all comfortable having a conversation? And just for knowledge, we will be starting off with urban and suburban, then we'll go into general topics. The intention is that our discussion on the ski industry will be at our next meeting in 2 weeks, but we'll see how we progress through everything. But members of the subcommittee, this is really your work and your time you've invested. Are you all comfortable with us having this discussion with half of our members present? Who wants to weigh in? Not everybody at once. Kurt, you're smiling. How do you feel about having a conversation with 4 of us?
A little uncomfortable. I just think, the more perspectives always at the table are more, the ideas come out of that, more ideas come out.
What would you all think if we had a conversation and talked through each of the ideas and got some initial straw polls of where you are all are on the issues, and then consolidated it into a more robust conversation, and we will chase everybody down and drag them to the next meeting so we can do the voting then. Would that feel better? Seeing some tentative nods and thumbs up. Okay, then we will do that. I'm going to give you what I took away from the feedback that we got. And I know this has been last minute and this may work out better. You all will have a little bit more time to digest it. You saw some survey results. We got 8 or 10 different folks that responded to some of the different surveys. We also got a number of letters from different agencies. So you'll see in the folder, there's a letter from the Denver Chamber. There's one from the Colorado Attorney General. There's one from Paralyzed Veterans of America. There's one from the Department of Natural Resources, one from CPW, and they addressed ski resorts and they addressed general outdoor ideas. And then we got these surveys. When I read them, here's what I took away, and I don't want you to think I'm agreeing or disagreeing with any of it. We had a lot of comments that some of what we were suggesting is already required. And why are we suggesting new things if what really needs to be done is enforce what does exist? Things like inspections or complying with the ADA. A number of the comments and letters said this is already a requirement. How about we just enforce it? Another big theme I saw in the comments was this seems pretty costly. This may be a good idea, but we've got a tight budget, and this is going to require new resources, new funds, whether at the state or the local level. We saw some ideas, particularly, frankly, around the ski industry stuff, that said this seems to be, and I'm paraphrasing, a solution in search for a problem. That these aren't as big of ideas or challenges, and we could address them through compliance and enforcement of what does exist. We did, to be very clear, also get a number of comments that were simply, I support this. This is good. We should proceed with this. What I didn't see a whole lot of, although I don't want to say none of, there weren't a lot of examples of somebody saying, this idea is okay, and here's the revision to it that I think would make it stronger. Or I disagree with this, but here is a better solution. All of that to say, we got some concerns raised about the practicality and the cost of some of this. Several people specifically cited today Colorado's current budget that is expected to be tight in this upcoming ledge session. But I think overall, nobody fundamentally disagreed with the commitment and the ideal. And I'm sharing this in kind of a long-winded way to say, if you were looking for the stakeholder feedback to tell you were right or wrong, I'm sorry you don't get that out. It's really going to continue to be on you. There are a number of folks that are challenging us to think about how we would implement this, to think about when you're talking local control, what could be the role of the state and how would they approach this? DNR pointed to a number of ways they're already taking action to highlight accessibility, and they welcomed additional ideas. But I would love for those of you that have had a chance to read at least some of the feedback to share your takeaways with the group. I think, silence will lead to Barrett calling on somebody. So Kurt, I appreciate you coming off mute.
Yeah, this is Kurt. Yeah, I mean, when I first read, you made me feel better already. I was very it's hard to be an advocate sometimes and not certain things make you get you frustrated, And I didn't see any big solution-based additions, I agree. I think there were some perceptions there too that maybe some people didn't get the full message, like, the ADA's been around for 34 years plus, and it's not being, there are a lot of rules being broken, not being enforced. And I think that needs to be pressed, that message. And maybe that needs to be done more at the state and local level. That piece of that. And then I just think some of those people, if you sat down and discussed them and all the things that we discussed together, that they might come to a different resolution,
Fair enough. Yeah. And I do know that we got this to you kind of last minute. So some of that I hope you've had a chance to read. And as we go through each idea, I've also got about 18 different tabs open on 3 different screens. And I'll try to read out what we heard from the Attorney General's office, from DNR, and from some others who were agency responses. They asked if they could have until last night, and weren't kidding when they were rolling in at 11:59 last night. Melanie, were you coming off mute to offer some thoughts?
Yeah, I was just, I had both a perception from reading the comments, and then I also had a question maybe that you can answer. And my perception was, after reading some of these comments, both from our subcommittee and for some of the other subcommittees, is there's a lot more nuance to a lot of these issues. And a lot of the recommendations read as very general, broad recommendations. And I think for the ones that we decide we're going to carry forward, I think we probably need to look at some of the nuance and try to really drill down on some of our recommendations so that we address some of that. That would be my overwhelming impression. And I agree with Kurt's comment as well. There's a lot of, we need to enforce the ADA more. I think that came through pretty loud and clear across the board. My question is, mechanically, how is this going to work next? We're gonna endeavor to come up with some recommendations. Do we have a sense from the lieutenant governor and her team and or the governor's team? What are they going to do if they have 80 recommendations in front of them? Or are they looking for a dozen across all the subcommittees that will really move the needle? I'm just trying to get a little bit of a sense of how we move forward here, because we're going to need to spend some time refining some of the ideas that we do want to move forward.
Melanie, I'm glad you asked that. And let me talk through process-wise, and I'm going to work a little backwards into your specific question about how many recommendations. And it's kind of funny. I was texting with the director of boards and commissions about an hour ago, and she said, "So Berko, there are only 2 more meetings for these subcommittees." And I said, "Well, that was my idea 24 hours ago, but I may be having to ask folks to have another one for exactly the reason you said, is we're going to have to get this nuance right." Working into your question, our intention is each of the subcommittees will have very similarly structured reports that go to the executive committee. We'll talk a bit about the process. Every idea that was generated will be an appendix, along with all of the feedback that has been received. That will all be very transparent. For each idea that you all vote to be a recommendation, we will include very specific language of what is the problem we're working to solve by making that recommendation, what is the ultimate end step or end state we're trying to create, and if it is a situation where it's going to take a transition to get there, what is the minimum and immediate steps that you all believe need to be taken on that? In terms of what we're expected to deliver in terms of numbers, we've been given no guidance, and they've intentionally been very broad discretion for the subcommittees to advance the recommendations that you all feel are necessary to discharge our task of eliminating barriers, in this case, to individuals with disabilities enjoying the outdoors. I will say in full transparency, and this isn't to walk down or walk back anything, I think we all go into this legislative session understanding Colorado is facing a tight budget. I think we also know that anytime there's legislative changes, they're going to lead to some debates and negotiations back and forth. I think we need to think about what is the appropriate lever of change. How many of these actually require legislative action versus they may be something that can be done by executive action, by rulemaking, or they're a matter of shifting the priorities. What the executive committee will do, Melanie, to get to your question, is they're going to take what I expect, what we're seeing from the other subcommittees is probably narrowing by anywhere from 20 to 40%. If they started with 20 ideas, I would expect fewer than that to advance. Maybe 50 to 70% as many as some consolidate and some folks say, yeah, I've heard feedback and maybe now is not the time to prioritize this, I think there is definitely room for you all to say we're advancing these 10 and we think these 3 are the most impactful and the most possible. So we would prioritize these. It will be up to the executive committee. They, according to the legislation, have full discretion to act on or dismiss any or all of the recommendations that we all make. Now, the indication they've given us is that they intend to take with great weight what you all put forward. And Melanie, I'm probably giving a longer answer without the clarity of how many and what they're going to do, but I wanted to be very transparent on process and that nobody has said we want a fewer number. I do think they're going to want fewer, or they'll be unlikely to advance a whole lot that require legislative action unless there is some common threads that package those together. For example, I think the COTA rewrite, if there are ideas they advance, that's going to require legislation. Some of the other ideas may not require legislation as much as additional FTEs or appropriations for state agencies to support them. Yeah, please.
One other just follow up. I know initially when we had talked about putting our report together, you had indicated that we would advance recommendations, but that there would be opportunity to, if the recommendations were not unanimous, there would be an opportunity for that to be reflected and for some discussion of why they were not unanimous recommendations.
Absolutely. And let me be clear on what will and won't go into the report. Obviously, these are public meetings and they're recorded. So if somebody wanted to come back and watch this on YouTube, they can see who voted which way. Our intention is that the recommendations will contain the vote count. So people will know how it was, what the split was. And anytime it is not unanimous, anybody voting in the minority will be more than welcome to work with Carrie and me to include language in it of the reason for their dissent. We also will invite everyone to include in with each recommendations things that you think are important considerations if it is in fact advanced. So absolutely there'll be opportunity for whether we call it a minority or dissenting report or just explanations of people's thinking when they didn't vote unanimously. Jen.
My question is, because of a lot of the comments about just needing to enforce ADA, and I think I'm somewhat embarrassed that I don't know the answer to this, but who enforces the ADA? I mean, who would be that overarching person in the state or throughout the federal government if we are talking about public lands?
I'm going to see if Jenny or Josh wants to join us. My understanding is it gets different in each different case. We have the Civil Rights Division, which would investigate claims of discrimination. Every state agency has their compliance officer, as do most municipalities and counties. Jenny, is there anything you would add to kind of more broadly when we're talking recreation, how ADA gets enforced in the different government and private sector settings?
I actually don't know the answer to that. The only thing I can comment on is how DORA would impact federal law, but I'm happy to reach out to DNR and ask them based upon their comments, the response to that question, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think any information that we have about that would be good, because if we were to make a recommendation saying we need to enforce ADA, saying state parks need to include that in their annual assessments, that ADA is part of that assessment, or recreation facilities have, quarterly ADA inspections, or I don't even know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I mean, how would we make a recommendation like that if that were to come up, to even make that feasible? And some of the comments were, there isn't money, there's not people, there's not staff to be able to do those sorts of things. So, yeah, that might be interesting.
Yeah, let me reach out while you guys are chatting and see what I can figure out.
Yeah, and we're getting into it. I see Josh coming on screen. So Josh, I'll invite you in just a second. This committee is in a unique position compared to some of the others because we're dealing primarily, we're talking about government, or we're talking both about government and private sector. So we've got government lands that would be the ADA and compliance officer from, say, CPW. Josh, did you want to lean in on when it comes to recreational facilities that are privately operated, when it comes to ADA compliance, is there a compliance mechanism beyond CCRD investigations?
Yeah, so I mean, currently the way ADA is largely enforced, like there are no ADA police out there. It's, you know, private litigation. That's typically how ADA is enforced. We have, I was just thinking through the other subcommittees, Barrick. And so on the government access subcommittee, there's been a suggestion about ADA coordinators in every government agency, having Title I, Title II coordinators. One of the suggestions was have that be their sole job. Currently, a lot of times people have those, but their duties as assigned. In the housing subcommittee, there's a recommendation around, I'm probably getting this a little bit off, but that there's an inspection done anytime a property is bought or sold, and that includes a full ADA assessment. What's not answered in those questions is who pays for that? What's their level of training required? And I think, kind of to Melanie's comment earlier about like, there's a lot of nuance here. I don't think that all those issues have to be completely solved in the recommendations coming from the subcommittees either, because there's a lot of different paths that could kind of go off of these and how they're actually implemented in the future. So, whether that's, recommendation of, hey, there should be a way to inspect these, and you kind of punt that to the executive committee to maybe come up with an idea, or to just leave as maybe there should be a way. And somebody later figures out how that could be funded, and what the training level is. I think that's the other thing that I would just add on anything like ADA inspections. Like, there's levels of knowledge of ADA and few people know all of it. And so I think that just something to think about, that, just saying it has to be inspected. There's I believe it's called ropeway inspectors, not actually tramway, the ski lift inspectors, that they're inspecting like the cables and the motors and like the safety of it. They're not nuanced experts in ADA, and probably would not be the right people to train for that, because they're into mechanical functionality and safety. So I think that's a big piece of it, is like who those folks would be. And again, I don't think that anybody expects that the subcommittees or the main task force are going to solve every detail of every one of these issues. It's more identifying the barriers. What's the problem? What's the end state? And maybe some ideas of how to get there. And then, we as a collective, we of government and advocates and, businesses and federal government can, keep working on how to actually get to that end state.
And Jen, with that, I think you're kind of getting the sense of both the nature of why we're having a conversation about the enforcement of laws that have been there for 34 years, and the basis of a lot of the feedback we got of who is it that you're going to require do these inspections? Who is it that you're going, and how many people are you going to fund? Because we have ADA compliance officers within government, and particularly at state agencies. You've got them in local government, but otherwise, as Josh said, it requires people seeking relief through investigation.
Yeah, and it seems like the system is set up so that it's reactive. I mean, that you have to file a complaint or for there to be any change or recognition that something needs to be changed, whether it being proactive, just as we talked about, doing the right thing when there's planning and that sort of thing. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. But yeah, those are good thoughts. And you're right. I mean, how would there's so many different levels of ADA, whether they're inspecting a bathroom or whether they're inspecting, a bi-ski at a ski area or something like that. I mean, there's so many different variables there.
That's right. And so, this is probably the best way, I think, to start workshopping this, is to start going through some of these, because these are all raised. From the complexity, people provided feedback when we get to ski on the next one. People talked about the complexity of, are you really going to have someone inspecting for every possible form of adaptive equipment? How can you possibly train someone on all of that? Or people say when we're talking about inspecting playgrounds or inspecting parks, how micro are you looking to go? Are you talking about the major parks? Or are you talking about every open park facility that there may be? So what I want to do is, we're going to start today. I'm going to try to ease us in. Rather than getting to the most complex and contentious, we're going to start with the urban and suburban. And don't let me saying they're not the most contentious or complex suggest that they're simple. They're not. What I'm going to do is read out what each of the ideas are so you recall what the group of the ideas here is. Then we'll start with one individual one, and I'll share some of the survey feedback and some of the comments we got from agencies. But here were the ideas that we shared. Number one was require periodic inspections for ADA and COTA compliance of all municipal parks and facilities, including playgrounds, to ensure compliance. Getting it just to what we were talking about. The next one, on the margins of that and intersecting, convene a working group to develop a set of best practices that can be published, referenced, or adopted as municipal code to maximize the accessibility of parks, including parking, restrooms, surfaces at and around playgrounds, and other maintained areas available to the general public. Third, promote the availability of adapted or other equipment at golf courses for use by individuals with disabilities. And the next few, create incentives for state, county, or city parks to expand access for the blind or visually impaired in areas including but not limited to green spaces, parks, and other similar facilities within incorporated areas through multiple solutions such as wayfinding, braille signage, technology-assisted navigation, or other means. So those were the ideas that we had generated around urban and suburban. You all have started teeing up what was some of the feedback, frankly. When I look at these, people offered feedback like playgrounds already require inspections. And I think this person was referring to the safety and the code inspections. Why would you require a second one to inspect what they're already doing? One person thought that was a waste of resources. One said, I agree with the idea of periodic inspections, but we need to understand what the fiscal implications would be. A couple of other people simply agreed. Some simply said, not all parks have facilities and restrooms that have ADA regulations. So we got some different feedback, and I will tell you, a theme of some of the government body feedback we got was that we already do some of these things because we have an ADA compliance officer. Down to what level are you proposing this? And I think Melanie alluded to this. Some of these ideas were very high level. They left room for whether it was confusion or interpretation of, are we talking about major parks? Are we talking about the open trailhead? But what I'd like to do is, in light of this opening conversation and some of the feedback, start going through these one by one. The first one being the idea to require periodic inspections for ADA and COTA compliance of all municipal parks and facilities to ensure compliance. And I'll remind, we talk about other outdoor rec spaces like trailheads in others of our ideas. This was when we were talking specifically about urban and suburban. But this idea to require periodic inspections, I would invite thoughts from the group on, do you want to keep developing this, and does it need tightening up and narrowing down to talk about what facilities or parks, what types of inspections? Do you want to get into naming what the period would be of periodic and what they're inspecting? Where are you all thinking on this idea of requiring periodic inspections of municipal parks? Sharon.
I guess this could go into some of the enforcement ideas, one step closer to actually enforcing things. I think with the Colorado weather changes and how things can drastically change from summer to fall to winter, I don't feel like quarterly checks would be unreasonable just because something can change from season to season. But it is like frequent enough where you have some safety there. I feel like it's a good middle point. I know there were some complaints around budgets, but we weren't tasked with figuring out a budget for Colorado, so that's kind of off our plate. I want to make sure we're putting forth recommendations that, those things are for them to consider. And the areas where enforcement is already there, ADA laws are already in place. If it's not working, then it's still a problem. And so we do need adjustment there. I don't think the answer is just, well, we have this in place, why not just enforce it? People do try to enforce it and it's still a problem. So we need to still make changes in that area.
So you would be an advocate of moving this idea forward with clear language of the expectation of these, as you're suggesting, quarterly inspections.
quarterly inspections, and if it is an issue, finding someone that's actually trained in the ADA laws or whatever other requirements we put forward, making sure that there's someone that's their task or that's their job and they actually know what they're doing. Like you were pointing out before, someone that's trained for the safety and working process of equipment probably isn't trained to handle the ADA requirements. So someone that's specifically trained to do that would be necessary.
And I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. I'm just trying to provide some paths. Would you be open to either this committee or the executive committee shaping that into something where that gets fit in with other inspections? I'm just looking at a couple of the comments of you're proposing, and I'm not saying you, Sharon, I'm talking about we are proposing a new form of inspection. Would you be open to that being piggybacked on to other regular inspections that occur at these facilities, as long as somebody was trained properly?
I think that would be helpful. Yes.
Kurt. You unmuted and remuted yourself.
Sorry about that. I just, the realist here, I'll just say one quick thing. Quarterly, I think would be hard to do. I'll just tell you, the city county of Denver has over 250 parks. So to find somebody, just to do those 250 parks would be quite a task. I would think maybe twice a year instead of 4 times a year. Might be more realistic. And there's still no, I just am worried what happens if you don't pass that inspection. So most of the parks, districts, cities, counties, whatever, special what's the word, I blank, but anyway, they all know that they're in violation, most of them, that there is no incentive for them to make them accessible. I think that's nobody, it's not being enforced. And then having a piece in there, okay, you have 15 parks that aren't correct, a timeline to fix those, because it does take, a long time to get the product and the labor and all that figured out on those public lands and things. So, I mean, am I making any sense? So I know when the Justice Department comes to like a big city and says you're in violation of the ADA, they don't just say, okay, you got to pay this penalty up front, because they know most municipalities don't have that money. So they give them a timeline of, okay, you need a plan how to fix these things. Something along that line. Does that make more sense? I don't know.
No, it absolutely does. And what I want to, put forward to this group is, I want this group to focus on being aspirational without getting bogged down in the weeds of how this will be managed or enforced. That I'm going to put on the exec committee, and at least one of those members, Michael Stone, is on. So he may kick me later for saying this, but the exec committee is going to have to figure out the details of the how this gets implemented and what the mechanism of enforcement is. I'm hearing a couple of different ideas on what may make sense for the periodic. And I think, you all and the exec committee can also look at other types of safety and access related inspections that occur in different types of code, whether that's building inspections, health inspections, or other things. And Kurt, I think you raise an interesting question for this group to offer their thoughts on, and ultimately for the exec committee to put forward their final recommendations on what are the consequences of non-compliance. Are we entertaining closing a park to all residents if it is not ADA compliant? Are we talking about some type of withholding of funds to a park district that says they can't afford to? So I think all that's going to have to be sorted out. Let me get Jen and Melanie and your thoughts about periodic, and let's don't for now try to define the period, but just the idea of requiring inspections of municipal parks and facilities, including playgrounds. Yep, Jen, I will just call on you.
Okay. I think that's great. And I think just in my experience from working with municipal government is that when you have your checklist that you're going through, or when an inspector comes in, there are those categories already in their inspections. And it might not be at every place, but again, I think it was, I don't know if it was Sharon or Kurt one time in a previous meeting, you guys said that, one of you said, the ADA passed with flying colors because it wasn't enforceable. And, I think we're finding that is way deeper than we expected. So I think having a periodic inspection would really benefit things. But again, if it's already kind of in the works, how do we make sure that that's recorded and the right people get the information and things are changed without it being kind of a punishable situation that might even create negative thoughts or negative compliance? I don't know if that's the right word, but I guess because we're trying to create incentives, not necessarily punishments.
Those incentives, and you all can offer your thoughts, and the exec committee can work to refine. Incentives could be everything from a list of who has, been inspected with what frequency, to when we are in more liquid times, any types of grants or incentives. Melanie, your thoughts on requiring municipalities to do these inspections?
The only, I think this idea of inspections and enforcement across our different recommendations is a solid one. It may be a general recommendation rather than in the specific like this. But the other piece that I want to be sure we come back to as we're talking through these is that our charge is basic access. And we want to be sure that we continue to use that language, I think, as we're thinking through these recommendations. Those are not incredibly specific comments. I'm not sure they're helpful, but I think this idea of enforcing the ADA and CADA and inspections to that effect probably cuts across more than just our urban and outdoor recreation. It probably cuts across some of the other subcommittees as well.
Absolutely. And Melanie, it is helpful because, if you all recall, we started these conversations 10 months ago now, and we were creating big lists of everybody got really impassioned about what the ski industry should do. And then folks said, well, maybe it's not just the ski industry. Maybe the aquatic industry should do that too. Maybe the state trails should do that. And so where we ended up going is, instead of saying this here, this there, we started saying, let's make sure there's accessible parking everywhere. And maybe to Melanie's point, there's a way to say, let's make sure it's being enforced. And part of that is periodic inspections, to include but not be limited to municipal parks, aquatic parks, ski facilities, and others. So we're talking about bucketing, and Melanie, this may get to the question you asked about how many recommendations. We may end up combining anywhere from 3 to 8 recommendations for compliance and inspections into a bigger category of ensure full compliance through means including regular periodic inspections, enforcement at these different types of facilities. Would that seem like what you'd like to see? Does that feel right to the other members? In general nods? Yeah. Sharon.
Yeah, I liked what Jen was saying too. Like, I don't think it's appropriate just to tack on a bunch of punishments. Like, I do think there should be something there for compliance, where if they had a set specific amount of time, maybe they start getting fined every day after that. Any money received from that can go into budgets for, perhaps on the incentive side, a grant for people to be able to apply, say, hey, we need these fixed, but we don't have the budget for it. You can apply for a grant to make things ADA compliant or to improve something or some type of standard. It kind of feeds into both. And with Melanie as well, like, I do think like having someone checking these things or periodic check-ins would probably make it easier for everyone as well, because then you know it's being asked of you and being asked of the ski industry, and you can say, look, we had someone just come out and check in January to make sure that we were compliant with everything. We're certified, we're cleared, we made sure that basic access is being met. It kind of resolves that issue for them as well.
Jen, thought on this? No? Okay. What I'm getting from everyone is kind of general consensus that yes, let's drive compliance and enforcement, but that maybe we combine that into a bigger theme of in all outdoor recreation settings, ensure compliance through several means that are incentive focused, but also ensure compliance and include periodic inspections. Is everybody okay with that general approach of how we're going to move forward to at least our next conversation when we get all of our members on board? Let me go to the next one that I think is important to talk a bit about. And it may be a shorter conversation. This idea was to require the state to conduct a study. No, I'm looking at the wrong one. I apologize. Convene a working group to develop a set of best practices that can be published, referenced, or adopted as municipal code to maximize accessibility of parks, including parking, restrooms, surfaces at and around playgrounds, and other maintained areas available to the general public. And going back to the conversation, what I recall from this was this is that idea of the ADA being the floor, not the ceiling. And you all talked about, yes, start with compliance, but what if we could provide a set of best practices of here's the type of surrounding areas for playgrounds or other outdoor areas if a municipality wanted to go that next step and adopt the best practices as their own code or just as the standard where they operate. Do you all think this rises to being a recommendation? Is it something you want to discuss in the report? What are your thoughts around a work group to develop a set of best practices that could either be utilized or could be directly adopted as code? Connor. Connor, we still have you on mute.
Thanks, Eric, and hopefully my sir here. Maybe some of the experts and advocates we have here on the call, do we know that this doesn't exist through any large national umbrella nonprofits doing work in this space? Or I just want to be really careful that we're not creating work where it's not absolutely necessary. And if it doesn't exist, I think we should absolutely do it. But I just wanted to defer to some folks who, some real experts in this space to make sure that we know that, we're not just recreating something that already has, taken a lot of work and already exists.
I think that's a fair and accurate question. And I don't know that we have an answer. So maybe this softens up from being a recommendation and more is a note or section. It could be to encourage the state, whether that's CDU or another appropriate body, to conduct a landscape analysis of what's been done here and potentially convene folks who have. Kurt?
Yeah, gosh, I wish Christina was here because
Yeah.
she stated it really well. I mean, the ground level is the bottom floor is set. They all know, all the parks know, and that's not even being complied to, especially with playgrounds. So I don't know what, I don't know if a work group would help with that or not, I think a work group that would help them figure out how to financially fix those situations would be better use of time. So
I think that's an interesting idea, Kurt. And I will tell you, I have heard from several members who I don't think would have any problem with me sharing this. The desire to focus on the most impactful things and to call for a regular review of, just for example, let's go change these 10 things and get a group like this back together in 2 years and 3 years and check and see if those 10 things move the dial on it or if we need to make further adjustments. So again, I want to be very clear. I'm not advocating that you vote one way or another on any of these ideas, I will just put on the table, there would be the option of what we were just talking about, this real focus on enforcement and compliance through multiple means and inspections, and seeing where that moves things along and saying, come back in 2 years and see if that has improved conditions and see if we need to convene this working group to set better best practices. Jen.
I'm not sure if this is the right time to say this, but as we're thinking about kind of these umbrella ideas that go through a lot of different, I think we need to pull back in transportation, whether that, you know, is in municipal areas, whether that's in getting to ski areas. I mean, that was a big topic of conversation that we have discussed throughout the last 10 months. And I think as a big recommendation, that's something that we need to have in there with, you know, some other little bullets and how that goes into every type of basic access.
I will keep that in mind, and I will make that a specific conversation point on our next conversation. Sharon.
I do agree with Connor that it doesn't make a lot of sense to replicate work that's already been done as far as like listing out some of the best practices. But along with that, I would be interested in, it might be some type of reward mechanism as well, to find the people that are actually leaders in the space. So instead of looking at best practices, find the leaders in the space, allow us to give, you know, business or put our dollars to where those people are putting forth the work. And then if someone wants to go out and, you know, move themselves up and look at ADA and improve on it instead of the floor being the ceiling, then they can look to those places that have already done it, have it in place, maybe take tips and ideas from them and build on it.
Thank you. I'm going to, and I'm not dismissing this, but we're capturing all of this. I think this is going to get incorporated into some of these ideas. We have 2 more ideas from urban and suburban areas I want to have a brief conversation about. And then we're going to get into this meaty clump of our overall general ideas, things like parking and shuttles. And Jen, we start getting to at least the last mile on transportation, so we'll go there. You all had floated though one idea for urban and suburban. People like to golf, and we have the idea of promote the availability of adapted or other equipment at golf courses for use by individuals with disabilities. So my question for all of you, is this an idea you want to include as a formal recommendation? Is this something you want to include in the general narrative about the availability of access and equipment? And I will remind you, when we get to ski, we'll also be talking about the availability of equipment. And you raised ideas about equipment when it comes to aquatic sports and trails. Thoughts on the golf equipment, though? My golfers are not on the call, huh? Should I hold that for a discussion about general equipment on our next discussion? Sharon.
Yeah, for golf specifically, the equipment's definitely needed. I mean, if you're talking about 18 holes and getting around, it's not really made for a regular wheelchair user or someone struggling walking. I mean, that one's pretty easy to make accessible, but it is heavily reliant on having that equipment available and accessible.
I'm going to interrupt us a little bit. Through the magic of Jenny Brown and DNR Executive Director Dan Gibbs, I see Wendy has joined us. Thank you very much. Wendy, this group has been talking about the need to enforce compliance with the ADA in some of our recreational facilities. And the question came up of how do we currently enforce ADA compliance? And we're curious what you can offer of how DNR, or if you know how CPW would approach it, but how do we enforce ADA compliance in our outdoor spaces? And does DNR end up having any role, whether official or unofficial, through partnership with our municipal and county partners? And thank you very much for the no notice diving into this conversation.
You caught me at a good time. I really appreciate joining. I was able to join a while, months and months ago. It was really good to see everybody. So happy to be here. The second question was, do we have any role with our municipal or county partners in terms of the ADA? And the short answer is no. in terms of, enforcement between federal, local and state. We can collaborate and we can share information and best practices, but we don't have an overall enforcement role there. And then the first question, maybe you can give me a little more detail in terms of the facilities that you're talking about. Or maybe rephrase that one more time.
Yeah, no, this is what's happened is we've been developing ideas over the last 8 or 10 months. And we've talked about general outdoor, everything from trails to riverheads. We were starting today talking a bit about municipal parks, which I understand are outside of DNR. But when it comes to the ADA compliance with state operated or owned facilities, and the people, as this group has suggested, that there be periodic inspections or floated the idea for feedback. Should there be periodic inspections to ensure ADA and Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act compliance? And somebody said, well, who enforces that? And as we understood it, certainly DNR has ADA compliance officers. I think you guys actually have more than one. And otherwise, it ends up with if an individual feels something isn't compliant, they can go through means, whether it starts with the department or they can go to the Civil Rights Division. But people are wondering, how is it that something is enforced presently?
Okay, thank you. There's a couple layers. One is that because we are a recipient for federal funding, the Department of the Interior, so the U.S. Department of the Interior actually has some oversight in terms of civil rights audits or audits that they can do. And so that's one layer there. The other layer is that we do have our overall ADA coordinator and our HR director. And so anybody can register a complaint with those two folks at any time through the executive director's office at the Department of Natural Resources. And then additionally, Colorado Parks and Wildlife has an ADA coordinator that focuses specifically on Title II, so public access. So for requests for accommodations for all of CPW's public programs, for really anything marina access, trails, hunting, fishing, buildings, you name it, there is a request process through that ADA coordinator specifically at Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Thank you. Members of the committee, do you have further questions for Wendy about that?
And also, sorry, just as people are thinking, we also set up an email address. It's called accessdnr@state.co.us. We're kind of disappointed because we don't get any emails there. We may not have advertised it well enough, but we tried to set up a super easy email, accessdnr@state.co.us, and then also we have some phone numbers as well for folks to call. The most, outreach we get is around Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and the outreach is usually at the local level, at that particular state park, for example.
Thank you. That's good to know. And while I've got you, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot just a little bit, in a few minutes, some of the other ideas that this committee has talked about is how do we make more information about the accessibility of different outdoor recreation facilities? And I know DNR and CPW provided us some direct feedback, but while I've got you, I'm going to seize that moment. People have suggested some of the ideas include publishing in accessible formats, whether that's digital or hard copy, the accessibility features of everything from different trails or roads or different parks. Can you share with the group just a little bit about what DNR currently does? And if I'm putting you on the spot, I apologize and we can circle back with you, but thought I would ask what it looks like right now if a member of the public wants to know, hey, that trailhead looks accessible, but am I going to get 50 yards into it and find that my adaptive equipment can't get through the next interchange?
No, I love this question. I was talking with CPW's ADA coordinator last week, actually, Jeremy Cifuentes, and he was saying that Colorado Parks and Wildlife just unveiled a new website. And so for their map finder, for that location finder, having accessibility information tied into every location. And then also we have an app called Cotrex, which is around trails. And so accessibility information there. My sense from him was that there's a good start, but he and we want to go much further with the information on there. And so I think that's, again, with Access DNR, if folks email us and say, hey, something's missing at this particular location, like those are the kind of things we want to hear so that we can continue building out that information. But yeah, that's very high on our radar. And I don't think we're 100% to where we need to be, frankly. We're still working on it.
No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you letting me ask you with no warning. And I think this group, in addition to the Colorado Treks and some other things, this group will probably have some recommendations or at least strong language endorsing and supporting a lot of where DNR and CPW have been trying to go. So hopefully we can provide some more energy behind the things that you all are already working on. Before I let Wendy go, since we grabbed her in the middle of her day, does anybody have any other questions for her?
Thank you so much for coming on and answering those questions and giving us a little bit of insight about what the process is. We appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Wendy.
All right. You're welcome. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks. All right. I'm going to keep us moving on. We have one more idea that I just want to get kind of gut reaction from, and then I'm going to move us to the general ideas, where we're going to spend the back half of this call, or the back 30 minutes, talking about parking and accessible access and shuttles. But there was another idea around creating incentives for state, county, or city parks to expand access for the blind or visually impaired in areas including but not limited to green spaces, parks, and other similar facilities. And you talked in this idea about multiple solutions, from wayfinding to braille signage, technology-assisted navigation, or others. The feedback, in short, was this. This sounds like a very good idea, and it sounds like one that's going to cost money. Were the two strains of feedback I'm looking at. What are your thoughts on this, and where does it fit in your thinking about a recommendation, an idea you think should be explored, a recommendation that should be prioritized? Melanie.
I think this is actually a really important recommendation, and it cuts across a lot of what we've been talking about. Our work group, with all affection and respect for our members here of our subcommittee, has tended to be focused on folks with mobility disabilities. And I think we have to keep in mind that we're looking at a much broader group of folks with disabilities who want to participate in outdoor recreation. And so I just want to say that about this particular recommendation and make sure that we're keeping the broader disability community in mind as we think through this stuff.
Thank you, Melanie. Other thoughts? Kurt?
This is Kurt. I was going to say, I think it's really important too. I don't think there's enough lived experience within our group here to really express how important that is. I have coworkers that I've mentioned this to, and they think that is a high priority for them, that they're kind of left off the list a lot of times in these areas. So
we will keep that. We will keep that in there. And Kurt, I will note that your point is one that broadly I saw on a lot of the different ideas, that don't lose sight of the full spectrum of disabilities and focus only on mobility, but to include auditory, visual, intellectual development, and others. Jen, your hand is up.
I agree. I'm just just agreeing with that we need to keep that in there to keep our focus more than just on mobility as well. And speaking of mobility, I'm getting Cody ready to go to PE class, so I'm going to keep my camera off, but I am here. So
We appreciate that. And I won't normally do this, but my friend Michael Stone, are you in a place where I could call you into this conversation?
Thank you, Barrick. Michael Stone here. Yes, please.
Your thoughts. The idea has been put forward to expand access to the blind or visually impaired to areas like green spaces and parks and other facilities in incorporated areas through things like wayfinding and braille signage and technology-assisted navigation. And as the one person on this call with that lived experience, I wanted to get your take on that.
Thank you, Barrick. You know, I'm struggling with a little bit about how Kurt started this, his statement about it. One of the challenges about being an advocate sometimes is overcoming the frustration, and I'm kind of knee deep in that today, as I've read some of the feedback that we've had, and so I'm still processing a lot. But to answer your question specifically, obviously, I would love it. I mean, currently none of that exists in any of the trails, anywhere you go, you know, throughout the state. There's been a lot of conversation and talk about creative ways to do so. There are some great apps, etc., and such. But you know, personally, I would love to see more of that, and of course, find creative ways to help them do that. But you know, currently, like I said, it just doesn't exist. You know, there's just no way. I do quite a bit of training actually, and sometimes for our park rangers and so forth, and it's almost a non-starter right from the parking lot. Anyways, but I'm happy to answer anything specific.
Do any members have anything specific? What I'm hearing is this is not only something that should be considered, but is very needed. Michael, is that, yeah?
Yes, correct.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to keep that in there in that vein of this is something that should be prioritized.
Yeah, and sometimes it's even as specific as to if somebody has a guide dog, for example, you know, anywhere from there. How is this going to be a trail that has off leash dogs, for example? You know, what are we going to encounter once we get there? Is my dog going to get attacked by an off leash dog? Can I even navigate that with a guide dog, for example? I mean, we could be very, very specific. It goes beyond just wayfinding, which is incredibly important, as well as signage and such, and whether or not it's braille or just tactile in general, could go a long ways. But hopefully that doesn't get lost. So if I show up to an area where I have my dog, you know, are we going to actually be able to navigate this together? You know, even though she's well trained to be able to do so. However, if we're going to be literally attacked, is that what we're going to find? You know, I'd rather not even start that process if that's going to be the case.
Understood. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you and appreciate you letting me call you into the conversation without advance notice like that. We're going to keep that one in there based on everything that I'm hearing from folks, and we'll work to tighten that language to make sure we're talking broadly. I'm going to move us over to, and this will be likely the last topic we get to today, but it's going to be a combined discussion of parking and shuttle service. I do see we have a couple of folks on the line who are not members of the task force. If you're here to provide public comment, I would ask that you drop a chat to either Carrie Steele or myself, Barrick Abramson, here in the next few minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to use every possible minute of this time to continue this conversation. But if you'd like public comment, drop me a message in there. I'm going to read what are several ideas that were socialized around parking and access after parking. And I'll share kind of big picture because these did get a lot of comments. One of the first idea here is to empower the state to require operators of recreation facilities to provide dedicated parking spaces and a system for confirming eligibility for those using adaptive equipment that is separate from the current accessible spaces, and placards with consideration for space needed for accessible vans and enforcement mechanisms for these. So we're talking about dedicated spaces for those using adaptive equipment. The next idea was to require the state to conduct a study of the codes, enforcement, and actual use of what are currently labeled handicap parking spaces, with consideration for the requirements of loading or unloading adaptive equipment and the implications of temporary placards. Some of this you all raised, or members of the group raised concerns that some of those spaces do not in fact work when we were talking about accessible vans. Some of them are used abusively. In others, in some places, some people felt there weren't enough spaces. Next two ideas. Empower the state to require that recreational facilities provide dedicated drop-off locations for those using adaptive equipment. And if you'll remember this had to do with ski areas as well as trailheads and waterfront access, where there wasn't always access where you could be dropped off with that equipment. Kind of connected to this, if no accessible parking is available at the primary entrance to a commercially operated recreational venue, require the operator to provide a free shuttle service for individuals using adaptive equipment. I think that one's self-explanatory, but welcome thoughts. I will say hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of the comments. Some of these received 15 and 20 different comments that ranged from, yes, this makes sense, to it'd be good to study how these spaces are actually using, to these are being used by people that don't need them, to what is the purpose of this? Are you trying to increase spots? Then he gets into some critique saying, what is the cost of this? Are you going to require this in places where people don't need these spaces? This could be useful if facilities do not have accessible parking that's close. This may present some issues with enforcement if the drop-off is only for people with disabilities and not a general drop-off location. But I'm combining these for sake of discussion because they really are about this arriving and being able to unload and enjoy the location. So we've got different ideas ranging from dedicated parking spaces for adaptive equipment to ensuring accessible spaces work to offload from things like accessible vans, to dedicated drop-off locations for adaptive equipment and shuttles where there isn't immediate access at the entrance. Does anybody want to weigh in on one more or this package? And does anybody see ways that this could be, if you want to advance it, a package of recommendations containing one or more of these? Melanie, please.
One of the things that we talked about when we were initially generating this group of ideas was and I really remember this because it seems like a sort of solid recommendation we could make, which is review the existing requirements under the ADA for the number of van accessible parking spaces required, and determine whether Colorado should have given our outdoor bent here in the state, whether Colorado should have a supplemental requirement for van accessible parking spaces.
And Melanie, just so I'm clear, and I know Carrie is capturing that looking at the question of how we're using those spaces and the ADA versus should Colorado have enhanced numbers there. Would you see that in lieu of any of the others? Is that part of a package of addressing accessible parking and unloading?
I think it's an important part of addressing accessible parking and unloading. I'm going to defer to others on the committee about this idea of a verification system for people using those spaces that becomes very difficult when you're speaking from the perspective of somebody who, operates a venue. It's very difficult to go up to somebody and say, prove your disability to me to use this parking space. And I would worry about that kind of a recommendation moving forward. But I think the idea of the number of van accessible parking spaces that are required was a 30-plus-year-old requirement. And maybe in a state like Colorado and in 2020, almost 2025, we need a higher number than that.
And I will just share with the group, for those of you who haven't had the chance to go through the survey responses, there were several concerns raised by people along the lines of one of the pieces Melanie mentioned about if you're creating a system to verify that someone does in fact qualify for this special placard of adaptive equipment, who is going to be doing that verification and what is that system? So I'm curious to hear from the group your thoughts on that system versus the idea of a streamlined focus on how many spaces we need, and do we need to be even re-examining what, not just how many of those spaces, but how they need to be configured given the advances in adaptive technology and the adoption of their use since the ADA was passed 34, almost 35 years ago. But as Melanie said, it's probably appropriate for us to defer to other members of this committee who have navigated this. Jen, please. Oh, muted still.
I think this is a really good topic to have in that addresses like access to dropping off equipment and just getting closer to an entrance. It addresses a lot of different topics that we've been tossing around, and I deal with this every day. Cody has a power chair, and it's big, and so we have a van that opens up to the side, not to the back. And so parking places, whether it's at a school, the grocery store, a trailhead, a ski area, doesn't always have enough room to completely open that lift and get her all the way down in whether another car is there or the edge of the parking lot. So I think reconfiguring where those spaces are and how much room, even though they say it's van accessible, doesn't always meet those requirements. And so sometimes then I have to back out and load her up, and I'm blocking traffic or putting her in an unsafe situation. So I think reconfiguring a lot would be a good recommendation without that being, I guess I'm being kind of naive in the planning part of this, but it seems like that would be a relatively easy recommendation for that to be solvable in some areas. So that's just my thoughts on something I deal with every day.
I appreciate you sharing the experience. Connor, please.
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation and really agree with what's been said. It feels to me like obviously this is a huge pain point, and some of the guiding rules and legislation is pretty far out of date. So I don't know before we make this recommendation if we are going to have the time or the bandwidth to dig deeper into what is existing and like refine the recommendation. But at the very least, it feels like we should be making, maybe we're making a recommendation to form a working group to do that work, to look and do some surveying across these different populations that need this. And where we're falling short, what the right number of spaces is, how things need to be updated, because it feels like there's just more work to be done here to make really thoughtful, actionable recommendations, and it's something we should be pushing for. But I guess that's kind of my question is, this clearly feels like it should be in there. What form should it take? What's the next step that we need to take?
Again, I'm going to just reflect what I'm hearing and check if this is where folks are. What I'm hearing is parking matters. and the number of spots, where they are, their dimensions matters, and who's getting those placards matters. What I'm hearing is maybe combine this with, as a frontline step, do an assessment of, does Colorado, given our outdoor recreational communities, and frankly, the explosive growth of the state of Colorado, certainly since 34 years ago, does that beg for more spaces? Does it call for larger spaces that allow for the type of equipment and vehicles that are used? And as part of all of that, a review of how those spaces are allocated and how they're used and where there's enforcement. Is that where folks are, is kind of combining these ideas into a general assessment to modernize the use of spaces in Colorado? Thumbs up, thumbs down, wavering somewhere in the middle, Sharon?
Yeah, I do think that this needs to be in there. There probably needs to be some more definition and research behind it. I don't know how much true even issues purple handicap placards. I know before we had talked about some of the handicap placards being misused, but it seems that they're issuing purple ones for people that can't access a parking meter to waive parking meter fees. And some of the ways of getting access to that placard is by having the inability to reach that meter using some type of wheelchair or other device, or having a disability that makes it a challenge for them to reach the meter. I think if there's placards being issued like that, there shouldn't be too much in the way of saying if you're using some type of device or you need clearance for a modified vehicle, van, or adaptive equipment, why not require a purple placard to utilize that additional space or that larger parking area? And I haven't seen that anywhere in Colorado. I've never seen a purple placard personally, but it seems that they're being issued.
I will have to reach out to our contacts over at DMV and some others to see what it could look like to have an additional placard. Kurt?
I wasn't aware of those purple tags either until somebody had told me that they actually got a ticket because they didn't have one of those in Colorado Springs. So I don't think Denver enforces that, but yeah, those are interesting. Well, shouldn't there, like, if I have the equipment in my vehicle, just showing that I have that equipment in my vehicle, couldn't that be? But that would require an attendant in the parking lot. But I mean that would be the hard part. I just something that happened to me recently. I Bronco game the other day. And we were going into the lot that has disabled parking. The individual actually asked the car window when they're checking your ticket, is there someone in this vehicle that has a disability? And I just raised my hand. Yeah, here, yeah, me right here. It was that simple, because they have a problem there with people using the disabled spots for their tailgating and things. So, but that little simple thing, I appreciated a lot.
And one of the things that I think we could do is package these together of the looking at the spaces, as Melanie flagged, looking into, as Sharon and now Curtis talked about with his placard. The good news is, as the subcommittee, what we need to identify is the end state we're trying to create, which is the way for people to be able to access basic access, as some people reminded us. Who's going to issue these placards and how they're going to verify that you are entitled to one is something the exec committee, the legislature, or the agency that would be responsible for it can sort out. I don't think we need to worry about exactly how that gets done. We know that placards can get issued for a variety of reasons. So if you all want to call for that, I don't think you need to worry about exactly the mechanics of how it would get implemented. I'm going to, because we've still got 8 minutes, I'm going to at least start a conversation on what is a couple of combined ideas. The first one is to require recreational site managers or operators of staffed facilities to have and publish in easy to find locations a point of contact to help individuals with disabilities navigate and access those recreational facilities. And kind of the other side of this coin, or a parallel idea, is to direct the state agency to collect, maintain as current, and publish in multiple accessible formats this information. Now, we've gotten some feedback that things like Colorado Treks are already working on this for some trail work. But I would love to just start the conversation today about this idea of, one, having navigators available if it's a staffed facility, and two, having all facilities collect and maintain information about the accessibility. And if you remember, we talked about everything from, could you do this as part of an app on multiple phones? Can you do it as a call-in information that would read it back to you? And we had some folks from CPW share that they were even interested in the idea of, they would have accessibility information. Could we go so far as having a way that if you're out on a trail and encounter something, an issue of accessibility, that you could in real time add that to the system, kind of like on Waze, or I guess now Google Maps, when you can flag that there's police with a radar or an accident on the road. But what are your thoughts about requiring staffed facilities to provide these navigators to help people understand the accessibility, and the non-personal side of that, the technology solution of providing a centralized listing or directory of these accessibility features? Sharon, I see you nodding. Can I get your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, we have technology and apps and everything else. There's no reason to not be applying it to this area. And then I think something that came up earlier, when one of the people were talking about they're not getting a lot of complaints or people writing into their emails. Sometimes it's just not the knowledge of where to access certain things. I know a couple of my friends and me, including myself, if I show up somewhere, if there's a problem accessing it, it's more likely that someone's going to express frustration or go home or be down or not participate in those things rather than filing or writing a complaint. A few people are a little more outspoken and will like notify those things, but having that access, live updates, allowing people that are outspoken to report things helps the people that aren't going to speak up and aren't flagging things or aren't filing complaints that are missing out on accessing those resources.
Other thoughts on either the navigators, personal navigators, or the technology, or different types of solutions where you could access information about the accessibility features? And while you think about that, I'll just share with you what DNR shared on this, on the idea to require site managers or operators of staff facilities to publish in easy to find locations a point of contact. They said, as at state managed facilities, more information and resources would be needed to implement the recommendation. They're unclear on whether visitor centers or facility staff could serve in this role as a potential idea. They said park managers are best positioned to address these needs, but there's capacity constraints for some of them. And they wondered, are we asking for a dedicated person there? And then in the idea of publishing in formats, they said CPW does collect and provide this information in their Visitors with Disabilities Guide, outlining accessible activities available at several CPW managed rec facilities, but implementing this recommendation at scale would require additional resources to track other facilities. CPW, they did note, has discounted or free licenses and passes for individuals with disabilities listed on the webpage that they've got linked. But other thoughts on either requiring a person to be the navigator or requiring the collection of information that would be published in different formats? Kurt, please.
Well, if it was a person, an actual person there, if you could incorporate that with providing other information too, to justify, and you would actually be creating something that would help everyone as opposed to just folks with disabilities, tie it all in together. I think that, I've had some history with a program that I ran for Denver Parks and Recreation, that was the case. You served the kids with disabilities, and the parents realized that we had the best of the best staff there, and it was our most popular program because of that, because you served those who need the most, it will serve the greater good of the group. So
That's good to know. I'm just realizing we are at 2 minutes to 1 o'clock. Melanie, I'm going to let you in, and then I will wrap up with the next steps that we're going to take.
I would just say here, I think the technology solution is the lower hanging fruit, given the personnel costs and challenges associated, and particularly in mountain areas, there's not always cell phone coverage for people in these areas. So I like the tech solution. It allows people to understand what the accessibility features are before they arrive. And I think it's lower hanging fruit.
With 1 minute, I just want to wrap up. One, I want to thank all of you, and I apologize we had to kind of shift approaches given attendance today. I think we did make some great progress, though, and what Carrie and I will work to do is take all of your ideas that started with the urban and suburban conversation about consolidating to address everything as this enforcement and compliance and getting clarity around that bucket to include things like periodic inspections of different facilities. We will also bucket together a number of these ideas that we've just talked about around parking, placards, accessible vans, and room to offload. And it sounds like particularly on some of the other ideas like wayfinding technologies, that was of strong interest. So we'll include that and adapt it a bit. Carrie is reminding me our next meeting is November 12th at 1 p.m. So we'll get back together then. Between now and then, I will take today's conversation, summarize it into these distilled or consolidated ideas. I would encourage you to take some time between now and our next conversation. We have now closed the public input, so we won't be piling more of that into the folder or onto you. But if you all could take a look, particularly at the survey responses for the ski industry and the last few for the outdoor recreation general. We'll pick those back up on our next call. And at that meeting, what we will do is we'll bring back language from our conversation today, and we'll look to go through that and the remaining topics. And we will then be taking formal roll call votes on each of these ideas and whether you want to advance them as recommendations. Does anybody have any questions before I wrap us up? Mr. Stone, as a member of the exec committee who joined us, I greatly appreciate you. Is there any closing words you'd like to offer?
Oh gosh, thank you. Michael Stone speaking. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody kind of running with this today with having a little bit less attendance. I feel that our energy is a little bit lower than in the past. I think it might be a good idea for us all to check in on that and think about maybe as to why. There's a lot of challenges that I think we're being faced with right now, and one of which is that and kind of why we have these challenges in the first place. I think that most of us who are on the call that do have lived experiences understand that we've been asked to solve these problems right from day one, and some of the feedback, that's exactly what we're getting. In other words, go back to the drawing board and come up with something else. And I think it's, and I appreciate Melanie's statement about getting back to our charge of, I don't love the phrase basic access. I think it equates to also the challenges I have with the word compliance. I think that, and Barrick brought this up, I think that we do have to stay focused on exactly what that charge is and why we are here, and using Berg's phrase of being aspirational, also a word that I have some challenges with, because why should we aspire to having the basic access? All things to just consider as we move forward. I think we need to hold tough and be consistent with really everything that we've gone through right from the beginning. And I want to thank everybody once again. Honestly, we're here because of your time, your energy, and your thoughtfulness. And it just continues. It never ceases to amaze me how solution based you truly are. And just really want to share a little extra gratitude.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Sharon, Melanie, Kurt, Jen, and everyone who's been listening to the conversation. It was a little bit of a curveball today, but I think we had some great discussions that really started bringing some clarity. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or Carrie. Call, text, email anytime if there's ideas you want us thinking about. Otherwise, we will consolidate the ideas from today and share them back out so that we can move those to voting during our next conversation. And we'll see you on the 12th at 1 p.m. I hope you enjoy.